The most dangerous sentence Jamie Dornan ever said was not spoken on a film set, whispered in a bedroom, or leaked through a tabloid source. It was delivered calmly, almost politely, in a studio designed for charm, laughter, and controlled vulnerability. I regret everything. 4 words. No context. No defense. No explanation. And in less than 60 seconds, those words detonated across the internet like a confession that had been waiting years to be heard. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were late. Too late to control. Too late to soften. Too late to belong only to the people they were meant for. The clip did not trend because it revealed guilt. It trended because it exposed a fracture. Viewers did not see a man apologizing. They saw a man realizing, in real time, that silence does not age gracefully. Silence compounds. Silence collects interest. And when it finally collapses, it does not fall quietly. It takes everything with it. What the audience was reacting to was not the apology itself, but the timing, the delay, the months of absence that preceded it. Because long before Jamie Dornan said he regretted everything, the world had already decided what everything meant. And that decision had been made without him, without Amelia Warner, and without the truth ever being consulted. The story, as it was sold, was simple. Too simple. A few photographs in Italy. A co-star. Proximity. Laughter caught mid-frame. A narrative hungry for repetition. The internet did what it always does when given fragments. It completed the picture with imagination and called it evidence. Headlines hardened overnight. Betrayal. Emotional affair. Marriage on the brink. The familiar rhythm of scandal returned, and with it, the unspoken rule of fame. If you do not speak immediately, the loudest version of the story will speak for you. Amelia Warner understood this rule better than anyone, which is why she broke it. She did not deny. She did not clarify. She did not cry publicly, defend privately, or outsource her dignity to a press statement drafted by people who had never met her. She disappeared. And that disappearance unsettled people far more than any denial ever could. Because silence from a public figure is often read as weakness, but silence from a woman in a scandal is interpreted as confirmation. The absence becomes the proof. The refusal to perform becomes suspicious. And slowly, without her consent, Amelia was rewritten from wife to obstacle, from partner to background character in a story that was no longer hers. This is where the power imbalance began to rot the foundation. Jamie Dornan was protected by ambiguity. Amelia Warner was punished by it. Every day that passed without a response allowed the narrative to harden. Not because the truth had changed, but because attention demands continuity. New angles were invented. Old footage resurfaced. Innocent gestures were reframed with sinister captions. The scandal did not need facts anymore. It had momentum. And momentum is more convincing than accuracy. Behind the scenes, the dynamic was not explosive. It was eroding. Friends would later describe Jamie as disoriented rather than defensive. Not guilty, but paralyzed. He believed, fatally, that restraint would be interpreted as maturity. That dignity would be rewarded. That silence would starve the story. What he misunderstood was this: silence does not starve speculation. It feeds it, slowly, relentlessly, until it no longer recognizes the people it is consuming. Amelia felt this before he did. When she left London with their children, it was not a statement. It was not a tactic. It was a necessity. And yet the media did what it always does when a woman exits quietly. It framed her movement as retreat, as defeat, as confirmation. The narrative sharpened overnight. She's done. She's walked away. She's protecting the children. Each headline removed another layer of agency from her decision, turning a private boundary into a public verdict. This was not about infidelity anymore. It was about abandonment, about image management, about who gets to be complex in public and who is expected to endure quietly until the noise passes. Jamie stayed. He watched the story outpace him. He watched the woman he loved become a symbol rather than a person. And still, he did not speak. Not because he didn't care, but because he believed timing mattered more than truth. That the right moment would arrive. That clarity would land if he waited long enough. But the right moment does not arrive on its own. It has to be chosen. And by the time Jamie realized that, the story had already chosen for him. The interview was meant to be safe, promotional, light, a controlled environment where questions are predictable and vulnerability is optional. That is why the break mattered. When the host asked how he coped with judgment, it wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. And Jamie saw, perhaps for the first time, not the accusations, but the damage caused by waiting them out. His voice did not crack because he was emotional. It cracked because the lie he had been telling himself collapsed. The lie that silence was neutral. The lie that not speaking was the same as doing no harm. In that moment, regret was not performative. It was disorienting. He was no longer responding to the public. He was reacting to the private cost of letting the public speak first. I Regret Everything landed the way it did because it was incomplete. It begged interpretation, and the internet filled in the gaps with everything it had already decided. To some, it was confirmation of guilt. To others, a rare moment of honesty. But what almost everyone missed was the most important detail. The apology was not aimed at the audience. It was aimed at one person who was not watching. Amelia did not respond. Again, 3 days passed before she was photographed. Sunglasses, neutral expression, controlled posture. And when a reporter shouted about the apology, she did not correct them. She did not validate them. She did not perform gratitude or resentment. She smiled faintly, as if the question itself belonged to a different reality. Later, someone would claim she said 2 words under her breath. I know. Those 2 words reframed everything. Not forgiveness. Not dismissal. Awareness. She had always known. Known the pressure. Known the fear. Known the way silence masquerades as protection until it becomes neglect. Her quiet was not ignorance. It was endurance. And endurance, when mistaken for passivity, invites exploitation. The public, sensing a shift, began to rebrand the story. Redemption replaced scandal. Tears replaced tension. The narrative softened because it could. Because once a man expresses regret publicly, the world is eager to move him toward absolution. The arc demands it. What the arc does not require is the woman's consent. Jamie felt the danger of that shift immediately. Sympathy arrived too quickly, too easily. It threatened to resolve a story that had not yet been addressed where it mattered. Which is why he chose the one act that could not be intercepted by publicists or reframed by headlines. He wrote to her, "A letter is slow. It cannot be edited in real time. It cannot be liked, shared, or defended by strangers. It demands patience from both sides." And in choosing that form, Jamie finally accepted what silence had cost him: control over the pace of repair. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not justify his delay. He named it. He admitted that he had protected an image instead of a relationship. That he had mistaken restraint for responsibility. That he had allowed noise to stand in for presence. The letter was not a resolution. It was an admission of debt. And then he waited. No response arrived. Not because Amelia was cruel, but because she understood something the public never would. That words spoken too late must be tested in stillness. Silence, when reclaimed, becomes power again. And before it could be broken, it had to be owned. Jamie sat with that, with the possibility that the story would not end cleanly. That regret does not guarantee repair. That accountability does not entitle reconciliation. For the first time, he was not managing perception. He was submitting to consequence. And that is where this story truly turns. Redemption is rarely about repair. It is about relief. Relief for the audience. Relief for the narrative. Relief for everyone watching who needs the story to end neatly so they can stop paying attention. That was the danger Jamie Dornan sensed the moment sympathy began to flood in. Because sympathy, once granted too early, becomes another form of erasure. It moves faster than truth and leaves less room for accountability. The internet decided the arc had shifted. Tears had been shed. Regret had been spoken. Therefore, healing must be underway. This is how public narratives work. Confession is treated as transformation, vulnerability as proof of change. The cost of this illusion is always paid privately by the person who now carries the burden of deciding whether the performance deserves belief. Amelia Warner never rushed that decision. Silence after the interview took on a different quality. It was no longer absence. It was pressure. Every hour that passed without a response forced Jamie to confront the possibility that his apology had been necessary but insufficient. Necessary to stop the bleeding in public. Insufficient to address the wound in private. This is where most redemption stories end, with a waiting man and a hopeful audience. But real relationships do not operate on narrative timing. They operate on trust, and trust does not regenerate because it has been acknowledged. It regenerates when it is consistently prioritized over ego, image, and convenience. Amelia had watched the public absorb Jamie's confession as if it were closure. She had watched commentators praise his honesty without ever asking what honesty would look like after the cameras were off. She had watched strangers speculate about reconciliation as if her marriage were a shared asset, jointly owned by everyone who had invested attention in it. What hurt was not the speculation itself. It was the familiarity of it. This was not the first time her experience had been reframed to make someone else's growth more palatable. When she finally appeared at his door, days later, she did not arrive carrying forgiveness. She arrived carrying a question. You said you regret everything. What does everything mean? It was not a challenge. It was an audit. Because regret, when spoken vaguely, is cheap. It can be shaped to fit the listener's comfort. Amelia was not interested in comfort. She was interested in precision. In whether Jamie understood what he was apologizing for, or whether he was apologizing for the consequences of being exposed. His answer mattered more than his tears ever had. When Jamie spoke, he did not list rumors. He did not defend intentions. He named absences. Silence where reassurance should have been. Distance where partnership was expected. Image where intimacy was required. And most importantly, he named timing. He admitted that he had waited until the world forced his hand. That admission cracked something open. Not trust, but honesty. Amelia did not soften because she felt sorry for him. She softened because he finally acknowledged the asymmetry. That the delay had not cost them equally. That while he navigated confusion, she navigated isolation. While he waited for the storm to pass, she endured being rewritten by it. This distinction matters. Because most public apologies fail not due to insincerity, but due to misalignment. They address the speaker's guilt rather than the listener's harm. Jamie, for the first time, stayed with her experience instead of rushing to resolve his own. Still, Amelia did not offer reassurance. She did not promise reconciliation. She did not frame the moment as progress. She named what hurt the most. You disappeared. Not physically, psychologically. He had retreated into caution, into calculation, into the belief that restraint was maturity. What she experienced was abandonment disguised as composure. And abandonment does not announce itself loudly. It erodes quietly until the relationship feels crowded by everything except the people inside it. This was the moment the power dynamic shifted. For months, the public had spoken over Amelia. Now, Jamie listened without interrupting. Without defending, without trying to be redeemed in real time. That restraint, finally, was not strategic. It was relational. They did not reconcile that night. That detail matters more than the headlines that followed. Amelia stayed, but not as a wife returning to order. She stayed as a woman deciding whether the man in front of her was capable of consistency, not just clarity. They spoke for hours. Not about Italy. Not about headlines. About patterns. About how fame compresses time and distorts priorities. About how being misunderstood publicly can make someone emotionally unavailable privately. About how silence, once normalized, becomes habit. The next morning, when she left at sunrise, the cameras captured a smile and declared healing. What they did not capture was the unresolved tension underneath it. Because listening is not repair. It is permission for repair to begin. The public statement Jamie released days later was restrained, almost understated. No grand declarations. No promises of forever. Just acknowledgement, respect, intent. It landed well because it did not demand applause. But again, the audience rushed ahead of the process. Praise followed. Approval surged. The narrative leaned toward triumph. Amelia did not participate. Her eventual post was not a response. It was a signal. A piano. Sheet music. Starting again. Not together. Not forever. Starting. This distinction is uncomfortable for people who consume stories as resolutions, because starting again implies uncertainty. It implies effort. It implies the possibility of failure. And most importantly, it implies that love is not restored by confession, but rebuilt through behavior. Months passed. Quietly. No interviews. No statements. No symbolic gestures designed for interpretation. When they were finally seen together, it was deliberately ordinary. Breakfast. Conversation. No performance. Jamie's comment to a reporter that love does not need to be perfect, only honest, went viral because it was simple. But what made it true was everything that came before it. The waiting, the listening, the relinquishing of control. Still, this was not the end of the story. Because redemption narratives are seductive, and they obscure the most uncomfortable question of all. What happens after the applause fades? What happens when the world moves on, but the work remains? That is where this story becomes less romantic and more revealing. Because love repaired under scrutiny is fragile, and the habits that nearly destroyed it do not vanish just because they have been named. Every story looks clean once the audience leaves. What remains is never the applause, never the outrage, never the carefully edited clips that once felt so urgent. What remains is pattern, habit, the quiet return of who people are when no one is watching closely enough to reward change. This is the part no redemption arc shows you. The part where sincerity stops being a moment and starts being a lifestyle. Because silence, once broken, does not disappear. It waits. And fame, once exposed as corrosive, does not retreat politely. It adapts. Jamie and Amelia's relationship did not re-enter the public eye as a statement. It leaked back into visibility through routine. A cafe, a walk, a shared laugh that looked unremarkable precisely because it was earned. To the audience, this signaled success. To them, it marked the beginning of a far more dangerous phase, normalcy. Normalcy is where old instincts return. The instinct to delay hard conversations because the day is already heavy. The instinct to prioritize work over emotional presence because work feels measurable. The instinct to retreat into silence when pressure rises because silence once masqueraded as safety. The difference now was not awareness. It was responsibility. Amelia no longer filled the gaps Jamie left behind. That was the boundary that mattered most. Silence was no longer absorbed. It was returned, not as punishment, but as consequence. The relationship no longer rewarded emotional absence with patience. This is what growth actually looks like, not forgiveness, but restructured expectations. For Jamie, this was unfamiliar territory. Not because he lacked love, but because he had spent years believing that endurance equaled strength. That holding things in was a form of protection. Fame had reinforced this belief. Silence in public life often reads as professionalism, control, maturity. But intimacy does not reward composure. It rewards presence. The greatest shift was not in how he spoke publicly, but in how quickly he spoke privately. Delays shortened. Conversations happened earlier, messier, less rehearsed. Amelia did not need perfection. She needed immediacy, the assurance that she would no longer be the last to know how he was coping. This is where most relationships fracture again after a crisis. Because early repair feels intense, intentional, almost sacred. Over time, effort competes with convenience. The danger is subtle. Not betrayal, but drift. They both knew this. That knowledge created a new dynamic. Less romantic, more honest. Less symbolic, more practical. They stopped protecting the story of their love and focused instead on the mechanics of it. Time allocation. Emotional labor. Who bends first? Who speaks first? Who notices first? This is not cinematic. It is sustainable. The public never saw this part because it cannot be condensed into a moment. There were no tears worth clipping, no quotes worth circulating. And without spectacle, attention faded, which is exactly what allowed the relationship to breathe. But fame does not vanish simply because attention shifts. It lingers structurally. Schedules still intruded. Expectations still pulled. Temptations still existed, not romantic ones, but psychological ones. The temptation to let silence handle discomfort. The temptation to let absence stand in for honesty. The difference now was consequence. Amelia no longer waited in quiet hope. She responded in real time. Not dramatically. Directly. Silence, when it appeared, was named. Distance, when it formed, was addressed. The relationship no longer relied on interpretation. It relied on articulation. This is what people misunderstand about forgiveness. It does not restore the old dynamic. It replaces it. What comes after is not a return. It is a renegotiation. And that renegotiation was the real redemption, not the interview, not the letter, not the viral quote. For Jamie, this required relinquishing a deeply ingrained belief that being misunderstood publicly excused being unavailable privately. That the exhaustion of fame justified emotional withdrawal. That providing materially compensated for disappearing emotionally. These beliefs had never been questioned because they were rewarded. Success had validated them. Silence had preserved them. Only loss made them visible. The irony is that the public believed he won his marriage back. In reality, the version of marriage he returned to no longer existed. What survived was not the relationship he once had, but the one he had almost lost the chance to build. Amelia never framed this as heroism. She never praised growth theatrically. She simply adjusted her tolerance. The relationship either met it or it didn't. Love, for her, was no longer about potential. It was about pattern. This is the part that unsettles audiences, because it removes the fantasy that love is restored by remorse alone. It suggests that sincerity without sustained behavior is just enough. Performance, even if it's a convincing one. Months later, when Jamie spoke about honesty instead of perfection, the line resonated because it was incomplete. Honesty is not a virtue. It is a requirement. What sustains love is not truth alone, but timing, consistency, and the willingness to speak before silence becomes damage. That is what this story was always about. Not scandal. Not betrayal, not even redemption. It was about the quiet violence of delay. About how silence, when chosen repeatedly, stops being neutral and starts being destructive. About how fame amplifies this destruction by rewarding restraint and punishing vulnerability. Jamie Dornan did not almost lose his marriage because of rumors. He almost lost it because he underestimated the cost of not being present while those rumors thrived. And Amelia Warner did not save the relationship by forgiving. She saved it by refusing to absorb silence anymore. That is why this story endures. Because beneath the headlines and the tears and the neatly packaged redemption arc lies a truth most people recognize, but rarely name. Love does not collapse in moments of chaos. It collapses in stretches of quiet.